Hey guys, rare, scholarly Scott with glasses here. This video is a comprehensive look at the entire asymmetrical multiplayer genre of video games. As someone that currently covers Dead by Daylight, I thought it would be interesting to go back in time to look at the history of what is definitely a very weird, niche genre that truly does suffer from a lack of competition. Now, while researching the topic, I found there were actually way more asymmetrical multiplayer games than I thought, so for purposes of not dying of old age before I finish this, I won't be including games that had a very small or non-existent player base, mods of already existing games, or non-English games. That being said, the first thing we have to do is define what an asymmetrical game actually is. To me, the term is very much like the term Souls-like, in reference to games that mimic the gameplay of the Dark Souls series of games. So Souls-like is really more of a vibes-based definition with a couple of key building blocks, but a lot of games can actually fit into the genre based on how much importance you place on each of these building blocks. I'd like asymmetrical multiplayer game to be less vibes-based and have a stricter, more clear definition. Wikipedia defines the page featuring these games as those in which one player or faction of players play the game differently from the others. I don't really like that definition. I think it's too vague and encompasses games far outside the actual genre. For example, they list Counter-Strike as an asymmetrical game, but no one's going to refer to Counter-Strike as an asymmetrical multiplayer game. They call it a first-person shooter. While it's true Counter-Strike does feature some asymmetry, I think the roles are overall too similar to count. If we are this vague, you could argue almost every game that exists features some level of asymmetry. In StarCraft, the Zerg plays differently from the Protoss. It's technically asymmetrical, but again, no one's going to refer to StarCraft as an asymmetrical multiplayer game as its primary genre. It's an RTS. So I'll attempt to define the term myself, and I'll be using this criteria for the rest of the video. My definition of an asymmetrical multiplayer game is, simply put, a game featuring opposing sides with differing gameplay mechanics, objectives, and number of players. Dead by Daylight, the pinnacle of the genre, features two teams with an imbalanced number of players, different objectives, and different mechanics employed by both teams, so it fits that definition. Even so, there are some gray areas here. For example, many people consider Left 4 Dead to be an asymmetrical multiplayer game, and for all intents and purposes, it's fairly close to the definition I just gave, aside from the number of players in each team being equal. But given the fact in Versus you have equal opportunity to play both the infected and the survivors, and the game doesn't end until all sides have had a chance to play both roles equally, it leans a bit more into being symmetrical in my opinion. The point is, there will never be a clear-cut definition accepted by everyone. This is just the one that I will be using for this video. But where did all this start? Dead by Daylight was an early entry into the genre, but most people know that it did not come first. Evolve came before, and there were in fact some games even earlier than Evolve that fit that definition. Concepts of asymmetry have been featured in several games, but it wasn't around until 2013-ish dedicated games to the concept actually started to pop up. The first example I can find is actually a game called Damned from 2013. I'd never heard of this game, and frankly it seems like most people did, seen by the game's extremely small player base. Although it never really succeeded in any way, early gameplay of the game features a lot of mechanics you would see in later installments in this genre. The concept of the game is basically this. 4 survivors were locked in an area and had to find a way to escape it via keys hidden in the environment. Opposing the 4 was a single monster that had various different abilities to trap or kill the survivors. The survivors couldn't harm the monster in any way, and they had flashlights with limited batteries, and their only hope of escape was evading the monster player. So yeah, these are crucial mechanics of similar games in the genre, including Dead by Daylight, which came out 3 years later. Damned did something correct that many games in the genre missed. It made its killer an unstoppable force. All you could do was avoid or slow it down, and I firmly believe this is a key component of success, and it's one of the main reasons Dead by Daylight is in fact so successful. Games in which the killer player gets reduced to a joke where survivors physically beat the shit out of them heavily reinforces the negative feeling of being bullied, causing players to drop the game. Games in which the killer is unable to be conventionally fought tend to do better in the genre, and Damned is actually the first example I can see of this. Damned was also far higher on the horror aspect than other games in the genre. The atmosphere was genuinely scary, sometimes to an even unfair degree, but people have commented on that being one of their favorite parts about the game, and it's actually a sentiment a lot of people are sad to see absent in modern asymmetrical horror games, which have generally traded fear for competitive fun. The game failed because, to put it plainly, it was just not very good. You pretty much instantly die if the killer catches you, there were almost no forms of tutorial whatsoever, and most importantly, no matchmaking. you could only play with a group of people or via manually picking a server. The game was also not really supported for very long, but interestingly, there's actually a Damned 2 currently in early access, so who knows if they'll actually find more success this time. As far as I can tell, Damned is the first actual example of a standalone asymmetrical multiplayer experience, as small as it was. Again, there might be other ones, but this is the first one I was able to find. Next is a game called Depth from 2014, which I actually played a pretty decent amount of in 2014 when it, came out. Depth was really fun, and it was a game in which a team of 2 sharks went against 4 treasure divers who were guided by a robot. The divers have to collect treasure and escape, and the sharks have to, who would have guessed it, kill the divers. The divers had various underwater guns from like air pistols to a full-fledged harpoon gun, and the sharks actually had their own powers, dashes, and even stats. You might have seen some YouTubers playing this game years ago, and it actually retained the player base for a decent amount of time. The game was definitely best played with a group of friends, as shark players would have to have a notable amount of coordination to catch people off guard while simultaneously avoiding gunfire. The interactions were kind of similar to Left 4 Dead's Versus mode, where you'd want to set up disables but also have a teammate disable another player who's about to stop the first disable. It was a lot of sharks protecting each other while they munched on treasure hunters, and the gameplay loop was honestly pretty fun. This is an example of a game that knew what it was, did it well, and did nothing more. It received a decent string of updates for years, from new skins to entirely new sharks with new powers, but at its core, the gameplay loop got stale sooner rather than later. Additionally, there were almost no actual, progressions for your character or your account, and I think that's the main flaw of the game and the main reason it died. The gameplay was shallow, and without anything to grind for, there started to be less and less of a reason to continue playing the game. I don't think Depth was really intended to last a decade or anything like that, but I think it actually did a great job for what it was. I legitimately would love to see a deeper sequel to this game. Chronologically, the next game would be Evolve from 2015. Evolve, for many people, was the first real major attempt at an asymmetrical multiplayer game, and oh boy did it have potential. The core concept of a weak monster slowly evolving over the match, erupting as this unstoppable beast against 4 hunters in the late game, sounded fun, and honestly, the game was fun for a time. But Evolve is a game that could have gone far as something like Dead by Daylight, but it just couldn't stop shooting itself in the foot. The initial launch of the game was already terrible, starting at $60 with over $130 of microtransactions. Not even the good like Path of Exile style cosmetic free-to-play model or anything like that, but actually like unlocks for characters themselves. The game was heavily pushed also to a point of being awkwardly forced into an esport, featuring tournaments and huge paid sponsorships. The whole thing felt very EA Games and like corporate, which put a very bad taste in everyone's mouth. So right out of the gate, the game had numerous issues, and we haven't even gotten into the gameplay yet. The game-to-game flow of Evolve was flawed, in my opinion. The first 5 to 10 minutes of each game featured basically nothing happening. You were actually encouraged to not interact with the opposing team as the monster, which by default is a red flag. No one wants to start a round of a match and have their first decision to just be run away and do nothing. I think this immediate boredom at the start of the match was actually a bigger problem than people realized. Games need to grip you immediately. If the game forces passive behavior, the game forces boredom for both sides. If the monster is constantly running away, it means the hunters are just constantly chasing, but nothing's actually happening. It's basically the whole W problem of Dead by Daylight, where one of the strongest strategies is just running in a straight line away from the killer. It's effective, but everyone's bored doing it. At the higher level, there were huge balance issues. It's mostly agreed that against 4 good hunters, most of the monsters stood absolutely no chance except the Wraith, who is commonly referred to as the nurse from DBD of Evolve. For a game with such competitive goals, the balancing aspect was never actually nailed. The game very quickly lost the support of its player base for any of the previously mentioned reasons, and short of a weird pseudo-revival with Stage 2, the game never recovered. I think Evolve was really a case of developers getting too far up their own ass and expecting massive success without actually earning it. This is frustrating because to this day, the late game moments of Evolve look genuinely captivating, and it's sad to imagine a world in which the game was handled with humility and grace rather than arrogance. Next, the game that needs no introduction in the genre, Dead by Daylight from 2016. If you've watched me at any point in the past 8 years, you'll know I've made several thousand discussions about the game, so I definitely know it pretty intimately. It's by far the most successful game in the genre, at least in the West, and frankly, it does more right than it does wrong, and sometimes that's just enough. Dead by Daylight had very humble beginnings, and by that I mean the alpha game was an absolute piece of shit. It looked bad, it was insanely abusable, and had absolutely no semblance of balance. The developers themselves admitted they were extremely new to game design, and yet still, something about the formula just clicked for people. Even in the extremely jank early form of the game, the player base was actually very respectable, completely eclipsing almost every other game in this list. The formula was simple and is still attempted to be replicated to this day. 4 survivors face against 1 killer. The killer can't be stopped, just slowed down, and the survivors have to finish 5 generators to power a gate to the exit. One of Dead by Daylight's biggest strengths is actually how simple the core game is. As a survivor, do generators and leave through the exit gate. As a killer, hit survivors and put them on hooks till they die. It's this simplicity that caused it to be so accessible to a wide player base, and its deceptively high depth is what kept people coming back. It's commonly said in the DBD community that even at 500 hours, you are still an absolute baby at the game, and there is genuine truth to that. The concepts of the game are simple, but there are so many little nuances that separate a good player from a great one, and aspiring to master all these facets of the game is a huge reason the game, despite numerous massive issues, retains such a consistent player base. Despite being the most successful, I'm actually going to spend the least amount of time on Dead by Daylight. Like I said, if you watch my content, I've already covered every possible talking point, and even if you don't, almost everybody knows the game at least at a surface level. If you want a more in-depth discussion, I have an entire video about why DBD is the king of the genre, which you can find in the description. There's not much more I can explain to you that you probably don't already know. There's no section for why this game has died because it is the cockroach of video games. It is seemingly immune to death. Going on 10 years now, somehow with no signs of slowing down, games have come and gone trying to replicate it, and really only a single one, ironically a clone of Dead by Daylight, ever found lasting success. Moving on is a game a lot of us have heard of and a lot of us have actually played, Friday the 13th, the game from 2017. The concept was similar to most in the genre. A group of survivors needs to escape from the killer, in this case none other than Jason Voorhees. Friday the 13th was a genuinely fun game, mostly when played with friends. The proximity chat was endlessly entertaining, and the moment-to-moment gameplay, while pretty simple, resulted in genuine giddy laughter. However, the game had numerous issues. It did not take players long to realize how easy it was to bully the shit out of Jason, and this is another example of a pitfall a lot of these games have. The killer has to feel powerful. If they don't, it contributes to the feeling of getting bullied and is an instant turnoff for a lot of players. Additionally, you couldn't choose which role you wanted to play. If you enjoyed playing Jason, you could only set a preference for it, but there was no option to specifically choose. I think this is another flaw several games in the genre have. Players typically like choosing the experience they want, and then getting that experience. When you queue for something and then get a role you did not ask for, it leads to frustration, early quit-outs, cycling lobbies until the correct role is obtained, and all that stuff. The moment-to-moment gameplay wasn't bad, however. There were various forms of Jason with different stats, although there were some common elements amongst some of the various forms. You were able to basically dissipate yourself and quickly move to other places to mimic the horror trope of the killer always appearing everywhere at the wrong time. There were traps, the ability to destroy objects and structures, and a few other sources of player interaction. Now, the campers mostly fled, but there were options for aggression like slapping Jason with a 2x4 to stun him for a decent amount of time, or even an entire side quest where you could actually kill Jason and win. There were several methods for campers to escape, and honestly, a lot of these were very entertaining. I have fond memories of powering up a car finally, and then accidentally running over my teammates while trying to escape. In a group of friends, this was genuinely hilarious. With random players, though, it was kind of more annoying than funny. Friday the 13th had a loose progression system with perks that modified the powers of the campers or Jason, but the perks were largely RNG, and it was sometimes difficult to get exactly what you wanted. Another game by the same developers, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, fell into the same pitfall, and it was a point of contention then as well. Updates to the game were not very frequent, and this brings us to the infamous lawsuit, and I have a potentially hot take for this. In 2016, there was a problem with the Friday the 13th IP, with two parties arguing over who owned what portion of it. Naturally, the Friday the 13th game would be something caught in the crossfire, and it was for this reason the developers decided to stop supporting the game. Firstly, the lawsuit would have just prevented new content, not ongoing maintenance of the game. Secondly, despite the fact everyone seems to blame the lawsuit for the game's downfall, the game actually starkly dropped in players a month after its release and never even came close to its launch player base. Lawsuit or not, losing 75% of the player base in a month has nothing to do with that. No updates would even be required yet. My hot take is that the publishers, Gun Media, who have a notoriously negative reputation, saw the lawsuit as a wonderful excuse to just drop their game that didn't have the player base they expected. Supporting this theory is the exact same thing that happened with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, also published by Gun Media. They saw the player base was dwindling and just said fuck it and abandoned the game. I firmly believe that is what happened with Friday the 13th. They just happened to get lucky with a great excuse. Sadly, the developers, not publishers of the game, Elphonic, seem to have far better intentions. Now, their games unfortunately almost always fail, but they do continue to support them long after it's even warranted to do so. It really feels like the issue was Gun Media, not Elphonic. Now, today, the lawsuit has been long resolved, so in theory, nothing would stop another game like Friday the 13th from coming out. The game was really well loved for a very short time, with numerous side-splittingly funny videos circling the web around release, but the fire quickly died and there was no kindling scene before the game died out. Friday the 13th absolutely nailed the casual party game vibes, and proximities chat amongst friends resulted in some of the best memories in the entire genre, but the game's skeleton itself was not really enough to support a lasting product, as the game quickly left the cultural zeitgeist. It's kind of hard to think how the game could have been handled differently, because we're never going to truly know exactly what happened behind the scenes, but it does feel like a lot of missed potential. Next, we have Identity V from 2018, the only actual successful game in the genre other than Dead by Daylight. In fact, despite a small player base in the West, Identity V is actually even more popular than Dead by Daylight worldwide, with millions upon millions of players, the bulk of which are in Asia. The funniest part, it's literally just a clone of Dead by Daylight. The only game that could compete with Dead by Daylight is just Dead by Daylight with a different twist. Even funnier, the game was created largely with the help of Behavior Interactive, who, you guessed it, actually made Dead by Daylight. A major difference is Identity V launched with primarily mobile phone intentions, and only later received a standalone client, which was essentially just like an Android wrapper to run the mobile game. As someone very put off by mobile games in general, I never actually played the game myself, but I do know several people that are very into the game. From what I can tell, it is genuinely just Dead by Daylight with different characters and powers and a couple of other different mechanics. The core mechanics are all copied, from generators or ciphers, to hooks or rocket chairs, to the hatch which spawns when there's only one player left, having exactly 2 exit gates, to having to complete 5 generators or ciphers, to perks that feature things like aura reading. Like, legitimately, it is nearly the exact same game skeleton, and that's probably why it's so successful. It's hard to even call the game a copy of Dead by Daylight, because like I said, NetEase worked in tandem with Dead by Daylight's own developers to make the game. I can't really say a developer copied their own work. All that being said, Identity V did start creating its own unique characteristics, introducing numerous entirely different game modes from the base game, although it could be argued Dead by Daylight does this as well with its modifiers. Identity V also has base survivor abilities instead of survivors simply being different skins with no gameplay effect. The core gameplay, from what I've been told, is more catered to what would be considered competitive play, with a much larger emphasis on being as sweaty as possible to win. Things like camping or tunneling, instead of being discouraged with several mechanics like Dead by Daylight, are actively encouraged and occasionally required to do so in order to win as the killer. Overall, the vibes are of a more competitive nature, and the player base for the most part actively supports this difference. It is really interesting to see how 2 games with the same skeleton took the common complaints of tunneling and camping and went into completely different directions. In Dead by Daylight, a killer can't remain near a hooked survivor for too long, or they can automatically escape the hook. Once unhooked, survivors remain invulnerable for 1 hit for 15 seconds by default. These mechanics effectively combat what would make natural sense in terms of killing another player. Now, Identity V goes in the complete opposite direction, with no anti-camp mechanics, a shorter on-the-hook time, and no form of anti-tunneling. I like how it's possible for the 2 complete opposite design philosophies to somehow work for their own respective games, showing that one isn't inherently better than the other. There is no discussion on its death because the game is doing just fine over 7 years after its release. It's something different, yet still very much the same, and in that regard, Identity V is a very successful game. I still can't get over that mobile art style, though. It's just very off-putting. The game also features a more robust ranking system than Dead by Daylight, featuring an actual, listed rank system and not some vague ranks that are not well explained and a hidden MMR and things like that. They overall seem to embrace the competitive nature of that type of game a lot more than Dead by Daylight, And again, a lot of people really do love that. I wouldn't say something like that would be for me, but I very much respect that the game has come into its own as a very, very successful juggernaut in the genre. Next, we have Deathgarden by Behavior Interactive, who by now is a name you should recognize a pattern with. I liked Deathgarden, despite it being a mess. The core concept was the standard Dead by Daylight format with a killer and survivors, but with a far more arcadey vibe and an additional survivor player, making it a 5v1. The survivors, or runners, or apparently later called scavengers, had to capture 3 key points in a randomly generated circular arena in order to win, and they captured them by remaining in an area for the required amount of time. Now, these 3 key points typically formed an equal triangle, meaning the killer would have to beam back and forth between them in order to prevent the runners from capturing them. In terms of power, the killer had a literal gun and primarily killed people by, you guessed it, shooting them in the face. The runners, unlike most games in the genre, were actually extremely mobile and could even do minor parkour with vaulting and climbing. I actually thought this aspect of the game was the most unique. Something about this genre attracts somewhat slow or cumbersome survivors, so it was a really welcome change to be just jackrabbit zipping all over the place. Now, to be fair, the increased speed was required for balance because the killer, had a fucking gun, so you kind of had to be able to move fast. The runners also had minor tools in order to help them survive because surviving in solo play was very difficult. During the release version, the killer could down you a single time and instantly execute you and remove you from the match with an execution, but they would lose bonus points for doing so. Obviously, people didn't care much and just wanted to kill people, so eventually they added in a respawn feature, which then resulted in killers just repeatedly leaving survivors on the ground instead of working towards their execution. They would eventually bleed out, and that strategy was sometimes more effective than the intended gameplay. All that being said, the gameplay was very rapid. You could go from alive to dead very quickly, so the runners were given tools to help stay off execution. That brings us to the tools that they actually had. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but I have distinct memories in the early days of the game being utterly pummeled with flashing lights, dizziness, disorientation, and flashbang-like effects from coordinated teams. A solo runner was absolutely no threat, but a full team would essentially give you a seizure and use that as their alternate win condition. This harkens back to the point I'll keep repeating. These scenarios made it feel like the killer was a piñata, and although my hunter could not actually be harmed, I was literally being harmed myself in my seat playing the game. The runner roll was actually pretty fun. You could dodge roll into tall grass to lose the killer, or straight up outmaneuver them with superior agility. The constant juggling of the killer between 3 key points often resulted in very tense gameplay, but it was difficult to really capitalize on this without being able to communicate with your teammates. Much like Dead by Daylight, a lot of the game kind of drastically changed with third-party voice chat, and expecting 5 solo players to perfectly balance distracting the killer while maintaining the other points was a tall order. Very often, the solo runner experience would just be a constant recovery loop of trying to pick up down survivors until there was eventually a final execution or a bleed out, while the killer experience boiled down to stopping solo queue players or getting absolutely obliterated by coordinated teams. Definitely sounds familiar. Deathgarden never really sported a large player base, and even with a rebranding patch with Blood Harvest, the game died to a lack of player interest. There were physically not enough people playing the game to find a match, and eventually behavior shut the game down. A large portion of this failure, in my opinion, was due to yet again no long-term progression or hook that a game like Dead by Daylight has. It's extremely difficult as a developer to plan an entire system around the assumption your game will last a long time, but often it just seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy if that step is not taken. There was not much to do outside of a match, and there was nothing really to aspire to achieve. Deathgarden was a great example of how behavior is not infallible and can release games that completely fail. Or if you view it more cynically, it shows how Dead by Daylight was legitimately just a complete stroke of luck and nothing more. Last year was another entry into the asymmetrical multiplayer genre that was released solely on the Discord store. Obviously, this was an extremely dumb decision and is likely the main reason the game died nearly instantly, because who the fuck even knew there was a Discord store for games? The gameplay of last year felt more like Left 4 Dead Versus, with only one special infected player at a time. 4 students had to complete various objectives, like getting gas to escape from one killer player who had to kill all of them before they completed these objectives. The killer, or the fiend, could actually be killed and respawn as an entirely different creature, of which the choices were the giant, the slasher, the spider, and the strangler. The giant was an appropriately named behemoth who could yeet survivors off elevation and instantly kill them, can also smash through walls at the perfect moment to instantly kill other players as well. The slasher was basically just Jason Voorhees with an average mix of stats, who could instantly kill survivors with a plunging attack straight out of Dark Souls. The strangler is just the smoker from Left 4 Dead. The spider was probably the most unique and could drag trapped players players into a hole to kill them. Similarly to Left 4 Dead, which is a phrase I'm probably going to use a lot here, the Fiend could spawn anywhere on the map as long as it was not too close to the survivors or in their line of sight. Each killer had a very long respawn timer compared to Left 4 Dead, incentivizing the Fiend player to not die, or at the very least made them plan to alternate killers and plan accordingly for changes. When killing a survivor, they respawned in a rescue closet that basically counted as one of their lives. The Fiend could also lay traps and lay in wait in these cinematic one-shots if they walked in the right area at the right time. They did actually look really cool, and they were very satisfying when you can land them. Typically, much like in Left 4 Dead Versus, just charging into 4 aware survivor players was kind of always a bad idea, and you'd be very quickly killed, stunned, or incapacitated, or any number of unpleasant effects that removed control of your character. This gameplay loop made it so the only real skill component involved was basic map knowledge and knowing when and where survivors would cross into crucial positions for you to ambush them. Overall, the gameplay was not very deep, had a very small progression system, and no real long-term hooks to keep players invested in the game. Additionally, launching on the Discord store only guaranteed the game would never see a substantial player base, and even a relaunch on Steam a year later could not save it. In 2021, Elastic Games went bankrupt and the game was shut down. Hide or Die was a fascinating game. Not the actual gameplay, but the history behind it. I actually found it fairly difficult to get a really good picture of this game's entire journey because it's no longer on Steam and the website for the game no longer exists. Diving through old YouTube videos and interviews, it seems like Hide or Die was actually 2 separate games depending on the date of the video you were watching. In 2018, a Kickstarter for the game was launched. Touted as a 1v16 asymmetrical Hunger Games-esque experience, Hide or Die at the very least sounded like it had a very intriguing premise. The proposed gameplay was roughly this. 16 players would be dispersed into an arena, and they had to look for items and objectives. They had to activate various fuse boxes around the environment to power up towers that emitted light due to a darkness mechanic, where if a survivor were to venture too far into said darkness, it would eventually consume them and make them join the one original killer player. Interestingly, in sort of an extraction game twist, a survivor player could actually escape the match at one of these lit towers at the cost of only keeping the meager rewards they had so far. Eventually, when there was only one survivor left, that survivor will be pitted against the original killer in a 1v1 deathmatch scenario where the survivor is finally given a weapon able to kill the hunter player. This is actually a cool idea. It combines the asymmetrical format with the thrill of extraction games, and frankly, I haven't really seen anything like that so far. It's too bad this never actually happened. After years of testing, Hide or Die eventually launched in 2020 as basically just a completely different game, in what most people called a terrible ripoff of Dead by Daylight. Instead of a cyclical round-based 1v16, it just became a standard DBD 3v1 experience with none of the previously mentioned unique mechanics. This whole fiasco reminds me exactly of The Culling, which was an extremely underrated battle royale game with melee combat that had a sequel that originally promised to be an expansion of the first game, and then just launched as an abysmally generic extraction shooter, nothing like what was originally shown. The game died like 25 minutes after release. In interviews, the developers mentioned that the 1v16 format was too ambitious for a small player base, which, I mean, yeah, that's a terrible ratio even for a game with a large player base. Asymmetrical game queue times are all about keeping the proper balance, and having 16 survivors needed for every one killer meant the queues were absolutely doomed from the start. There's no way that would actually work. I can't even find reliable information on the revamped version of the game because it died so quickly that there's almost no actual content for it out there. Overall, Hide or Die was a game that had a vision that exceeded the realities of balancing a queue, so the skeleton that was proposed simply could not succeed, which is a shame because reading over their Kickstarter and seeing their original idea makes me sad that the vision they wanted would never actually come to light. I am hesitant to include Resident Evil Resistance on this list due to my own rules and definitions. It was technically not a mod for an existing game, but you could also only get it if you bought Resident Evil 3, so it wasn't really a standalone game either. The game was also not that great and basically boiled down to the killer player being more of a director of basic zombies than an active participant in certain instances, while the survivors just did basic puzzles and killed generic zombies to extend the time in which they had to finish everything. Basically, I want to acknowledge that this game exists, but it doesn't technically fit my criteria to actually cover. Predator Hunting Grounds is an interesting case. Now, I'll be honest, I never actually played this game, and that's for one reason: Epic Games Store. I typically don't bother with games that have Epic Games Store exclusive releases for two main reasons. One, I just hate Epic Game Store's application. Nobody likes it. We all use Steam and don't want to have another launcher for one game. Secondly, Epic Games is where developers go when they have no confidence in the game that they're making. What I mean by that is since Epic typically funds games up front in exchange for the exclusivity, developers don't actually have to have their game last in any meaningful way as most of their payments already guaranteed, rather than risking the game not receiving funding and then dying on Steam. If the developers have no confidence in their product to perform well, why should I? Now, from the trailers and even some clips of gameplay, the game actually seemed pretty good. Unfortunately, the developers IllFonic, despite multiple tries, have never actually made a game that lasted more than a month or two in terms of a decent player base, and Predator Hunting Grounds was no exception. Predator was another 1v4 game with one Predator player and 4 special operatives collectively named Fireteam Voodoo. The human players had various objectives that didn't necessarily involve killing the Predators, such as sabotaging shipments, killing NPC humans, or retrieving a VIP from an area, all while avoiding the Predator. There was a constant alternative win condition for the players where they could actually end up killing the Predator. This would result in a new extraction type event where the humans would hold out against hostile forces for a specific amount of time to win. The Predator, as you could expect, can do Predator type things. Cloaking, stalking, rapid movement, etc. were all present to actually very accurately thematically nail what it'd be like to be playing such a creature. There was definitely a certain voyeurism level intrigue to silently stalking the human players and planning the perfect time to ambush them, but like most games on this list, balance was all over the place. Most players agree matches were very one-sided, with the Predator player being instantly lit up as the alternative win condition, or a skilled Predator absolutely dismantling the human players. The game didn't really have any type of skill-based matchmaking, so there was never really any guarantee what kind of match you were going to get. A major problem in the game was the strength of the human players. For some reason, you could straight up parry the Predator with a dinky little knife and absolutely obliterate them, which really just kind of takes you out of the entire experience. Again, the common pitfall of having the killer be physically harmable just seems to be a recipe for disaster in every single one of these games. This has been and will continue to be a very common trend in the genre. Again, because the game launched on the Epic Game Store exclusively, it never even had a player base to begin with. Queue times were never good, and after only a few months from release, it took a minimum of 10 to 15 minutes to find matches. The game does feature a kind of jankily put-together single-player experience with AI-controlled opposition, but that's not really the experience you want when playing this type of game. The game featured very little account meta progression, another pitfall a lot of the games in the genre make. IllFonic also dropped updates in the game fairly early, as there were barely any players to justify it. It's sort of a weird chicken or egg scenario, where there are no players because there's no updates, and there are no updates because there are no players. I can't really blame them for not updating to a dead player base, but maybe, I don't know, release the game on Steam so you can actually maybe have one to begin with. The sad part is, a year later, they did release the game on Steam at nearly the exact price as the year-old release, which I think was also a huge mistake. This was a last-ditch effort to save the game, not a chance to keep the same release price like people were going to spend $30 on it. The game reportedly had numerous bugs that were never fixed due to a lack of updates, which really cemented the game's place in the grave. I will be completely honest, the devs at IllFonic seem to be good people, but I legitimately do not understand how they keep getting all of these licenses. Friday the 13th, Predator Hunting Grounds, Killer Klownz from Outer Space, and Ghostbusters all died extremely quickly, and yet somehow they were given the rights to Halloween for a new game in 2026. I seriously do not get it. How do they keep getting these licenses? All of their games very quickly fail, and yet people keep throwing funding at them. They're clearly not very good at making games. Whatever. In a nutshell, lack of progression, an Epic Games release, no matchmaking, numerous bugs, and terrible balance are the main reason Predator Hunting Grounds failed. Technically, the game is still up and playable, but with a player base in the low double digits, there's no real reason to purchase the game. Home Sweet Home Survive is a game I actually played and even made a few videos on. The core gameplay was the standard 4v1 format with survivors and one killer, and even featured a lot of elements that feature in Dead by Daylight, like forms of looping. Instead of generators, survivors had to complete 3 rituals throughout the map, and the killer had to ensure that they didn't finish. This was another game in which the killer could be physically attacked, which is usually a big no-no, but Home Sweet Home actually had a pretty unique combat mechanic in which the killer could generate a short-lasting shield to ignore any offensive action from survivors. It seems simple, but this created a lot of interesting gameplay where a survivor would rush me down, only to not actually do anything but bait my shield. Then once it expired a few seconds later, I'd get pummeled. However, if I correctly read that they were going to be baiting, I could just smack them and then they'd take damage. It was almost like a simple fighting game system tacked onto Dead by Daylight, which I actually appreciated. Balance, from the little I played, was pretty abysmal. Survivors had legitimate infinite loops with these little drop-down holes that had pretty much no counterplay. There were also small vents that connected rooms, but these were significantly more counterable as they always ended up in a specific spot, so you could be waiting for them when they popped out. A huge frustration was the fact that the millisecond a survivor interacted with one of these vents or holes in the wall, they would become instantly invulnerable, causing you to attack and miss despite physically connecting with them. A later game on this list, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, did this as well, and it was immensely frustrating. Survivor gameplay was a bit more fleshed out than some in the genre, with basic weapons or blinding tools available for use at any point. Interactions with the killer were kind of always the same, even if it was a little interesting with the fighting game mechanics. There wasn't any real progression, and the game itself was barely even a full game, acting as more of a building block for a sequel, I guess, called Home Sweet Home Online, except that game also died. As an aside, after doing some research, I still don't know what the hell Home Sweet Home Online is. The Steam page is enigmatic at best, featuring no visible reviews except one random line in the description from IGN, which reads, "Experience the balanced PvP battles with Home Sweet Home Online." Even more bizarre, when I go to IGN to see this alleged review, it's not even a review, but a paid advertisement from the developers, so they are literally quoting themselves in an ad for themselves and featuring that as a review for their game on their Steam page. What? The game launched with a somewhat decent amount of players in the mid-thousands, but after just 2 months it dropped to triple digits, and in 2023 the game was officially shut down. I still don't know the actual reason. Some sources say it was always intended to be part of Home Sweet Home Online, and others say it was because of a decaying player base. This is a reason I decided to not include any games that were not in English, because it leads to significant confusion exactly like this. But the game was loosely translated, so I thought it deserved a spot. No matter how you look at it, I think Home Sweet Home Survive was not really a game that was intended to last a while. Propnight was an attempt at making Prop Hunt into an asymmetrical multiplayer game, which, to be fair, it kind of already was. If you've never played Prop Hunt before, it's basically hide and seek, except you can literally turn into things in the environment. In Gary's mod, where a lot of Prop Hunt's notoriety came from, the smaller the object you'd pick to disguise yourself as, the less health you had, and vice versa. Here's the problem with Prop Hunt, at least in terms of being a standalone game. It just isn't very deep. It's a very silly, fun mode you play with friends for an hour, and then you just don't touch it again for a while. The very simplistic nature of hide and seek doesn't really elicit a strong player hook, so designing an entire game in the vein of Prop Hunt and then slapping Dead by Daylight mechanics on top seemed like a recipe for failure. As the survivors, you still had to power 5 generators, or prop machines, to win. Killers down players and put them on hooks or rocket chair, hypno chairs, whatever the fuck you want to call them. It's all the same mechanic, right down to the 2 exit gates at the end, the 3 hook states, slugging. I feel like the developers just picked a bunch of mechanics from Dead by Daylight and just sort of Frankenstein them into a Prop Hunt game, not realizing the fun components that keep people playing Dead by Daylight are the chase between killer and survivor, of which Propnight has absolutely no gameplay whatsoever. You basically just had to hide, and that was it. The game had very little progression and the depth of a puddle, so although it did actually retain a few thousand players for a few months, eventually people realized there was just nothing left to do and quickly dropped the game. A free weekend in 2023 would see the player base jump back up for a bit before the game was finally shut down. The developers, Fantastic, also just stopped updating the game to work on their blockbuster Game of the Year the day before, which did so unbelievably badly that it single-handedly killed the entire company, and thus Propnight died alongside it, finally going offline in 2024. Evil Dead, the game, is a mixed bag. Aesthetically, it was actually pretty great for the genre, and it really nailed the vibes of the series, even getting decent reviews from gaming outlets. A lot of people genuinely enjoyed the game, and a lot of people felt it was too complex to get into. I personally never played the game myself, so I asked a friend of mine, Pixelbush, who played the shit out of it, to give me the bullet points. For a brief summary of the game, he wrote, Evil Dead is a 4v1 with 4 survivors facing off against 1 demon. The 4 survivors are effectively playing a looter-shooter as they roll around the map doing objectives, while the demon is controlling AI minions, setting up traps that scare and attack survivors and occasionally possessing the survivors and controlling their characters to turn on teammates. Right off the bat, one of the biggest issues was, yet again, Epic Games Store exclusivity and a fairly steep launch price of $45, which is very high for the genre. This ensured the starting player base was going to never be as big as it could have, which is a huge problem because games tend to grow exponentially with their audience and die just the same. The game was apparently extremely complex with a lot of skill expression, which was great for dedicated players, but a nightmare for actually getting new players into the game. The fact that there was basically no tutorial whatsoever for the demon role really added to the gut punch of trying to very quickly understand a fairly complex game. This again really is why Dead by Daylight and other games that follow this formula were so successful. Easy to learn, hard to master is always the correct way to do it, and Evil Dead was not easy to learn. The progression was also punishing to new players, as a lack of skill-based matchmaking ensured new players would be placed with veterans, and since your level on a character directly correlated to important stat boosts and even new abilities, a new player would be at both a knowledge disadvantage and a literal character strength disadvantage. This was particularly bad for the demon role because they needed 45 levels to max out their kit, which took a fairly long amount of time. Pixelbush also says there were numerous ways to completely cheese the game for the survivors, and Saber Interactive, the developers, were way too slow at addressing these issues. Apparently, cars were wildly overpowered, and numerous exploits like weapon drops and resource duplicating sat in the game for most of its lifespan. Combined with the extremely rough new player onboarding experience, the lack of updates, it's really just no surprise the game never found a stable footing. After only 1 year, Saber Interactive dropped support for the game for no real clear reason other than simply just not enough people were playing the game to justify it, I guess. All in all, this is largely what happens when a game is released on the Epic Games Store. They die before they have a chance to see any exponential growth. Video Horror Society, or VHS, had a pretty significant crossover with Dead by Daylight's audience, so I knew a few people that actually played it. Unfortunately, the game featured mostly closed testing, so by the time everyone had a chance to play, the game was already populated with experts that absolutely annihilated anybody new to the game, completely killing their interest in it. That, in my opinion, was VHS's biggest problem. The new player onboarding was abysmal. I've watched several of my friends play the game, and I still have no idea what the hell is going on. There were no tutorials, and the game launched with half the player base already being experts, so seriously, what the hell were you supposed to do as a new player? Despite being labeled as a Dead by Daylight competitor, VHS actually had more in common with Evolve than any other game. In reality, the game was just a deathmatch and featured no escaping. Either the survivors die or the monster dies, so really the game was just one giant arena in which the survivors had to build weapons and plan attacks, and the monster had to defend themselves and ambush survivors when they were unprepared. Even according to veteran players, the game was largely survivor-sided. So much so, in fact, that the queue times for Monster were nearly instant, while Survivor players would have to wait 15 to 20 minutes minimum because frankly no one wanted to just get bullied the entire match. It's been a common theme in this video that when the killer becomes a punching bag or piñata, the game fails. The smaller role always has to have more power than the numerous role, or the queue times will never align in such a way that people can actually enjoy the game. Ex-Dead by Daylight content creator Dowsy has a great video on why the game died, which I'll link below if you want a more detailed picture, but I was startled to learn that the game featured absolutely zero marketing. Legitimately not a single dollar was spent on any marketing campaign. Despite favorable conditions for success, a repeated slew of closed betas into an unannounced early access made it so the game's success relied entirely on word of mouth, which obviously did not work. A few larger streamers attempted to play the game, but the vicious onboarding for new players quickly deterred them from holding any interest in it. For whatever reason, games in the asymmetrical multiplayer genre that are built upon the idea of intentionally killing the killer player always seem to fail. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why this is the case, but it really does circle back to the fact that the killer role should never feel like they are getting bullied, and VHS unfortunately failed pretty heavily at that. I do think it's possible to have a deathmatch style 1v4 be balanced and successful, but it seems infinitely harder than the standard you cannot hurt the killer format. I would love to see other developers attempt this, but good luck to them, and please spend some money on marketing if you do. Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed was another unfortunate failure by Elphonic. The game had so few players, I actually don't know a single person who played it, and I'm very heavily invested in this genre. So I'm gonna rely on my good friend Wikipedia for this one. Apparently the gameplay was as follows. In a match, the goal for each side is specific. The ghost's aim is to haunt the selected location and avoid being captured, while the Ghostbusters must focus on trapping the ghost with the option of closing rifts to reduce the ghost's chance of success, but must do so before the ghost can fully haunt the location. If a ghost manages to fully haunt the location, a countdown timer begins, and the Ghostbusters will be required to close down any active rifts and capture the ghost before it runs out, otherwise they lose the match. Each side functions differently during a match, with the ghosts working on their own, using a combination of stealth and sabotage techniques against their opponents, while the Ghostbusters must use teamwork, coordination, and a variety of gadgets to defeat the ghost. Both sides earn experience for their equipment and abilities, while at the end of a match, players earn experience towards their overall level. While reaching certain thresholds will unlock new ghosts and appearances and new items for use in matches and customizing their avatar's appearance. Additional experience can also be earned by completing daily and weekly challenges focused on different tasks, such as destroying bins or completing a set number of matches. Does any of that sound fun? Yes? No? I don't know. The game had like 80 players not even a month after its release, so it barely even fits the criteria for this video, so I'm just gonna move on. Oh boy, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is a rough one because I actually really enjoyed this game and played it a lot, as broken as it was. Right off the bat, this was probably aesthetically the best asymmetrical multiplayer game yet, and the overall vibes could not have been done better. Devs were adamant about being fans of the series, and you can see how excited they were to nail it, and again, they actually sort of did nail it. But then you played the game. The core concept was a bit different from the standard Dead by Daylight setup. You actually had 3 killers and 4 survivors instead of the standard 1vx format. This meant killers now had to actually work as a team, and strangely enough, the survivors were almost better working by themselves, which was quite the switch up for the genre. The gameplay was fairly simple. Survivors had to do various objectives to power or unlock exits, and there were multiple different ways of exiting the map, like unpowering the electric fence that bordered the edges of a map, powering a fuse box that powers a limited time exit door in the basement, or by finding a valve to attach to a pipe system that revealed another exit. Basically, there were 4 possible exits and only 3 killers, so the game ensured it was impossible to simply camp these objectives. I'll just say it, the survivors in this game were just blatantly stronger than the family, or the killers. For the first few months of the game, you could literally stun killers for minutes on end by slamming doors in their face, and a character named Leland had a shoulder check ability that stunned any killer as well. It was common to have one of your family members on the killer side be literally permanently disabled by someone chain stunning you, and you'd actually have to call for help to get out of it. Obviously, this is ridiculous, though absurdly fun on the survivor side, to be fair. Catching a competent survivor by yourself was legitimately impossible in the basement and somewhat possible above ground, depending on your killer. This meant you very much had to work with your 2 teammates on the killer side in order to actually down people, but dedicating too much time to one person meant 3 other players were making progress to the exits. On release, by far the most busted character in the game was Connie, whose ability allowed her to instantly unlock a door. This is a normally slow progress that can even attract the attention of the killers, but there were Connie rush squads that would have people halfway to the exit quite literally before you could even gain control of your character on the killer side. The fuse box exit on specific maps was so easily obtainable, you could have someone escaping the map in literally 2 minutes. It would take Leatherface a minute to just get out of the starting basement from game load to exit. It was ridiculous. The point is, the game was horribly balanced because, frankly, I don't think the devs cared one way or the other. A weird perk system, somewhat like Friday the 13th, meant you had to kind of roll the dice over and over to get your favorite passive effects, and some of these were so broken you kind of just had to use them. There was one perk that enabled survivors to reset their own stamina bar multiple times, which basically meant a single killer would never actually be able to catch up to a single survivor, which again makes absolutely no sense, with one exception, which is Leatherface revving his chainsaw in an open field near an exit gate. Here's the main issue with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's a fundamental one. The developers were on record saying they just wanted to make their vision of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and no matter what, they were going to stick with that vision. While commendable, this is a bad idea for a multiplayer game unless you intend for it to die, which, as we'll get to later, apparently they kind of did intend for it to die. It's nice to have a way, you expect people to play the game and balance it accordingly, truly, I can respect that. The problem is people will break your game. They will optimize it. They will suck the fun out of it. If you don't care and fix nothing because players aren't supposed to play like that, your game will die. This is the major reason Dead by Daylight is so successful. The developers of that game had an original vision of stealth, horror, intense gameplay, but after seeing how their vision quickly erodes with repeated play and turns into basically a hyper game of tag, they actually restructured the game to fit how the players actually played, and because of that, the game is flourishing. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre developers had a vision, stuck with it, and despite players shitting all over that vision, just sort of plugged their ears and just said, they're playing it correctly, everything's fine, everything's fine. Then there was the whole drama of Gun Media, the publisher, and their notoriously horrible PR. There were community managers for the game legitimately arguing with teenagers on Reddit like absolute losers. There's no real reason to name names anymore, but I have an entire video about this if you want further information. There's also a drastic lack of content for the game. Despite an extra family member or two and a few new maps, most updates were extremely overpriced cosmetics. Even worse, there were items for sale when the developers had already planned to shut the game down. According to the developers, they had completed their full vision of the game and were ready to sunset it, which is an absolute fuck you to any active players of the game. This is one of the reasons everyone hates Gun Media. They've repeatedly released a game with a big license, support it for 5 minutes, then just fuck off once they've sold enough copies, all while telling you that was their plan all along. And yet somehow they keep getting licenses. I guess these license holders only care about initial sales and absolutely nothing about reputation, which, to be fair, yeah, that tracks. There were also a bunch of other mechanics for the game that just didn't really matter very much, like killers could gather blood and give it to Grandpa in the center of the map, but most games ended before that was even relevant, so it kind of just didn't matter. There was also a little side minigame where you could stab the Grandpa, and that's basically all I did because I found that fun, but it was just sort of like a meaningless mechanic that, again, was something that the developers kind of had a vision for, but players just were like, this is dumb, and just ignored it and just rushed out the gate. So there was a lot of examples like that. The game was just horribly balanced, horribly handled, and apparently, according to the devs, they did everything they wanted to, and this is what the game was supposed to do. Last like a year and a half and then just die. So mission accomplished, I guess. Killer Klownz from Outer Space was yet another failed attempt in the genre by Elphonic. Right off the bat, the game was $40 with $65 worth of DLC, and I'll be honest, that was just nowhere near its actual value. Creating a game off of a fairly obscure 80s IP and then charging $40 for that is an insane business decision in my opinion, especially when the game straight up just did not have that much content in it. The gameplay was very simple, in a 3v7 format where the three clowns try to trap survivors in these candy cocoons. I will admit, one of the only entertaining things about the game was the muffling that was attached to proximity chat if a survivor was in one of these cocoons. You could yeet the cocoons everywhere, and it was just hilarious watching people have these muffled screams and just fly across the arena. Other than that, the game was extremely basic. Survivors scavenged for items that let them achieve multiple escapes like Friday the 13th, and that was that. There was no real meta progression and nothing to keep players actually playing the game. I felt like I had already played the game before, and I think Elphonic just has a specific feeling that made me bored almost instantly. The game died so quickly that I don't know anyone who even made videos about the game. Seriously, I don't get how Elphonic just keeps getting licenses. God bless them. So, that is the rough history of the asymmetrical multiplayer genre so far. Like I said, there's no way I could be completely thorough, and some of these games warranted an entire video among themselves, which is why I linked in the description whenever I had like a more detailed discussion about that type of game, or that game specifically. I just wanted it to be a general look at where we came from and where we currently are and where we're going to be in the future. I know I missed some games, like I said, impossible to be completely thorough. But there are definitely some things on the horizon too. Elphonic somehow for the 17th time acquired another license with the Halloween IP, and so there's going to be a new Halloween game by them, which, given the track record, probably going to fail. Let's just be real. It really comes down to the fact that there's two main games in this genre that work, Dead by Daylight and Identity V, and they're both pretty close together in terms of actual gameplay. It does seem, and I'll quickly summarize my why DBD is the king of the genre here, that there is a specific formula with easy to learn, hard to master, having a killer that cannot be harmed, having the killer be a little bit stronger than the survivors to make the queue times, feasible. These are all the things, along with consistent updates, that a game in this genre is required to actually get. A lot of these games in the genre will just abandon it too quickly once the player dies. DBD even had a pretty decent following at the start, so you even need a good player base at the start, which is hard enough to do by itself. So, like I said, there are so many things that combine to make a successful game in this genre. It's just so many times people have tried it and they've done some of it, but you need to do all of these at the exact same time, or it seems like the game will fail. So that's overall the discussion about this. I do appreciate you watching. See you next time. That was a terrible outro.